Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining this evening. Can everyone hear me okay? Oh, wow. I see it's a party. I see a bunch of comments already. We got Asian Man in the house, Katie, Jason, Brandy, Rebecca, Aaron, Chloe, Kyle. Thank you guys so much for joining. Super excited to dig in. As all of you know, maximizing the movement and really talking about how we can make marketing more inclusive has been a passion of mine for my whole career, but especially in 2020 with everything that we've been facing. This has become an urgent call. So I'm just so glad you've all taken out the time. So sound check. Can everyone hear all right? Lighting's good. All right, we're good to go. So as we dive in today, I want to get started by grounding us in the excitement we should feel about this time. Whatever our beliefs or opinions about the political and social climate here in the United States, one thing we've learned this year that I think we can all believe, everyone shares, is that we have a latent and internal desire to be inclusive. We all want to be seen. We all want to be heard. And as marketers, we have the power to make that happen for people in a way that no one else in this world has the power to do. Now, of course, that might sound, of course, as a marketer, we're going to say that, but we'll dig into it. And I think you guys are going to leave here believing it even more than you already do. So let's jump in. First thing we're going to talk about why inclusive marketing matters beyond everything I just shared. So diversity, equity, and inclusion have been on the corporate agenda for years, as we know, for decades. In fact, in a book called Diversity Inc., written by Pamela Newkirk, which I recently read and was super inspired by, she analyzes the effectiveness of diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives across companies. She talks about Coca-Cola and all of the challenges there that happened in the 90s. She digs into Hollywood and talks about a lot of the challenges there from an HR and sort of corporate social responsibility perspective. One of the findings that she shared is that in 2014, Google, a company we all know and love, spent $114 million, just let that soak in, that number, on their diversity program with few to no measurable results. Okay, and this was something that was gleaned from a Russell Reynolds diversity survey that's referenced in the book. Now, let's flash to what we know as marketers. The composition of our organizations from a corporate social responsibility perspective, from an HR perspective, is always going to be important and is 100% worth investing in. But when we think about the full scope of what we can do, why aren't we thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion in terms of our marketing budgets and what they have the power to do? I mean, I see a couple people here on the screen. I know what all of you could do with $100 million, and there certainly wouldn't be no measurable results. So flashing into what we learned from Edelman's brand trust survey, just to give us another reason to believe. United States brands are 4 times more likely to gain the trust of their consumers and customers when they take action on a social issue. The fear of losing trust when you decide to integrate what's happening in society in your marketing is a fallacy, as this data proves. And this was done in the spring of 2020 by Edelman, very reputable firm, as we all know. So with those two sort of reasons to believe, let's dive a little bit further into what I mean when I use the term inclusive marketing. So let's go ahead and continue. Why this matters. Now, this might seem like a controversial thing to say, but it really is the big picture. And I want us all to embrace that what I'm gonna say here is coming from a place of total and complete positivity. We have moved from a world where it makes sense for us to do multicultural marketing to a world where we are marketing in a multicultural society. Whether or not we want to believe it, the reality is this is a multicultural society that we live in. And there's no need to sort of put our marketing efforts that are focused on reaching diverse audiences into a silo that's not the mainstream. We have evolved towards this in warp speed in the year 2020, as we know. The Band-Aid has been ripped off of so many of our hesitations. And now as marketers, it's time to just really take advantage of our opportunity here. So with that, let's dive further in. Let's talk about how inclusive marketing really works. So the thing that I want to focus on right now is the definition of what I've come to call the RSR framework. And this is really the way to think about how you can create inclusive marketing that hits on elements of a concept we all know very well, the triple bottom line. I created this program, Maximize the Movement, to really guide ambitious marketers like all of you towards this shift. Again, we talked about it. It's not about multicultural marketing. It's about marketing in a multicultural world, which is our reality. And because of this, our opportunity is quite simply, think about the agenda that you all have in front of you as marketers today, okay? So to maximize the movement, to benefit from the power of true inclusivity, you simply need to refine your existing marketing strategies and tactics to make a social impact that will in turn also drive outsized bottom line results for your business. That's the key. And the fundamental belief that we're all investing in and committing to when we do this is that, again, the world wants to be inclusive. This is a fundamental desire of us as humans. We're tribal people, right? We want to connect with each other. So the idea of being inclusive is something that's native to us. So it's going to drive business results. And we're going to talk through a bunch of really interesting examples that are going to show us how that works. So, oh, I thought I heard someone else commenting. Can you guys hear me? Okay, sir? Okay. So when we dive in to this definition of what inclusive marketing really is, again, it's about using your marketing to make a social impact that also drives outsized bottom line results. So your next question might be, well, how do we approach doing that? How does that actually work? And that's where we dive into the RSR framework. The elements of what I like to call a max move. So the whole play on maximizing the movement, you create max moves. These are strategic actions that your brand, that your team, that your company has decided to make that drive all of these three elements simultaneously. So let's start with revenue impact. We all know the import of revenue. It is literally the thing that drives value for our businesses. It's what really matters to us. It is the bread and butter, right? So for a max move to be one, it is something that is going to drive sales. It's going to acquire new customers and users. It's going to align with whatever your goals are for the year that you've already established. We're not creating net new or tangential initiatives. Now, moving into social impact. This is the needle that's a little, or the needle that's harder to thread. That works. I might have reversed that. But you get what I'm saying. This is the part that can be tricky, right? So what do we mean when we say making a social impact? And I've drilled it down to these three really easy things that I think we can all relate to. So when you're going down your checklist of have I accomplished this, making a social impact is about, quite simply, a marketing action that does drive that revenue, but also creates inclusion, that supports diversity, that furthers equity for a marginalized group or a cultural cause. So we're going to flash the definition of that down on the screen here so you guys can remember it. But think about this idea of a marginalized group, an underserved group, as separate from a cultural cause that's important. Both make a social impact, both are important And both are things that your brand can decide to get involved in, depending on what really makes authentic sense. And we'll talk about that when we get to reputation. So we talked about using your marketing to make a social impact that also drives outsized bottom line results. The definition of this social impact is something that really makes sense for your brand, company, or product, but also creates value for a group or a cause in that way. So let's continue to move forward. And we're going to talk through some really interesting case studies that bring this to life for you. But the third one is really important, and it's often where some of the brands we'll talk through, may have had some challenges, but that's the reputation impact. So this means that what you've decided on to improve your revenue and sort of achieve those revenue goals, what you've decided on to make your social impact to a group that's relevant and authentic to your brand, or a cause that's relevant and authentic to your brand, also in turn improves your brand's reputation. And that's critical because we know it's a key driver of loyalty. This is how you increase your share of voice in your category. This aligns with your brand's mission, vision, and positioning, your core brand elements, and it also improves your brand health. And the way to really think about how you pressure test this is by looking back historically. What has your brand or your industry or your company been known for? What are wrongs that need to be corrected? And how can you figure out what your max moves are, your strategic actions that deliver social impact while also driving the bottom line? How can you align those in a way that is going to affect your reputation, elevate your brand's reputation in a meaningful way? And this has to start with authenticity. It can't be about being self-serving, and we'll talk about some examples. Okay. So before we get into how it's done, I'll ask if anyone from the group has questions. Feel free to drop them in the chat. We have some good time for Q&A at the end, but want to make sure this is interactive. Allison on my team is monitoring the chat and engaging with you guys all here that I see. And so we'll be here to make sure your voice is heard as we dive further in. Okay. So when we look into how it's done, these are our case studies of brands that are making max moves and really, we think being super effective, and then a few that may have missed the mark. So without further ado, let's jump into the case studies. Okay, so we're gonna start with Uber. As you all know, I love, Jen, you totally nailed it. It is a Kamala Harris tribute outfit. Had to address that in the comments. Yes, we are all celebrating that moment with our white right now. So if you think about what Uber has stood for, it's about access and providing access to transportation in a really democratized manner. I benefit from it. We all do. We know Uber has ran into some challenges over the years with how inclusive their organization really is. And this summer, after the brutal murders of George Floyd, as we all took stock of what we were doing with our marketing to figure out what our message should be, they released this very splashy campaign, billboards everywhere, a lot of them are still up. And the message was, if you tolerate racism, delete Uber. Okay, so it's great. And it does get me excited to some extent. But then when you really start to think about it, you remember back to the challenges Uber had years ago with their inclusivity, and the hashtag then was delete Uber. So from a reputation standpoint, it starts to feel a little false. We also know we're in a time period where, quite frankly, their ridership is down. So this feels like a safe move in a way that almost feels a little self-serving. And then from a revenue standpoint, I mean, I don't know what worse way to sort of approach building your market share than telling a number of your drivers to not use the platform. Now, I'm not arguing that this is necessarily the wrong message, but what I would say is that the campaign, the sort of initiative on which this message was based, which was actually Right to Move. And if you go to the website that these ads click to, it actually says Right to Move, and it's all about education for drivers and sort of making sure they're creating space where everyone in their markets has a right to move That was the message. But they wrapped it in something that seemed sexier, quite frankly, and didn't hit the mark. It didn't allow them to focus on these three elements of the RSR framework that we find really, really important. So great intentions, but I think with a little bit more thinking, Uber could have done a better job with the wrapper of this campaign. And quite frankly, I would have called it Right to Move. So moving on to our next example. Citi. We all know that Citi is doing some really amazing things under the leadership of Carla Hassan. And one of the ones that I'm finding really exciting is their Action for Racial Equity initiative. And this is all about making banking more accessible to the Black community. We know this is a historically relevant problem, right? So you got the reputation check right there from an industry standpoint, and they're addressing it, okay? And then from a social impact standpoint, obviously, if you are giving a disenfranchised group access to banking where they may not have had it before, you're creating equity in a super meaningful and measurable way. Like it doesn't get more of a slam dunk than that. From a revenue standpoint, we all know that if you're a banking company, the more people that have accounts with you or use your products, that's revenue for you. So it hits on all three. And I think they're doing it in a really, really robust way that also involves a lot of cause initiatives. Make this feel really, really good for Citi. And so, oh, we have a question from Jason. Jason, how do we think the agency choice impacted it? I think Jason's going back to Uber. Okay, so before we continue to talk about Citi, I'll step back a little bit. That's a great question. And I think we all have really deep and important relationships with our creative agencies. But in this particular case, I won't name the agency, but if you did your research and looked it up, you'll see that the message that Uber came out with is very similar to what's on their website. So whether or not it was the choice of this group that has done really impactful work and continues to for Uber, I don't necessarily think that was the problem, but I think a lack of dialogue and potentially a lack of real guidance that the team may have needed to make sure they were pressure testing whether or not this message made sense for Uber in the same way it may have made sense for the agency. There's maybe a bit of a disconnect there. So I think making sure you're looking outside of the people that you talk to on a day-to-day basis in your work as a marketing leader is super important. Getting perspectives beyond that core group of folks is really, really important. And in this case, I think, had the team who worked on the campaign done that, they might have made another decision. So that's what I'll say there. Thank you, Jason. Okay, so back to Citi. Now, one thing that Citi really teaches us that I think is important to focus on as well is that you don't have to choose one pillar of social impact to make a difference around. So, racial equity for Black people is clearly what this is about. But if we go to our next example, we also see that, and this is actually a post from Carla that I saw on LinkedIn, we also see that Citi is taking the reality of what their product line actually can do, so in this case, credit cards, and figuring out what are the ways that we can really authentically make a difference, right, with our consumers who may be from an underserved group, in this case, the non-binary and trans community. We talk about inclusive language, and it's a big and important thing for us all to focus on. I mean, it's always been, but right now, I think people are listening more. And what Citi has done here is they launched a true name feature, which it's so simple, but allows any human to have any name on their card that they want. And I mean, what better way to attract customers who that appeals to? And beyond that, customers who are allies, I'm more likely to want to bank with Citi understanding this exists. And then from a standpoint of, revenue, that tracks. From a social impact standpoint, like, again, it's about making people feel seen. That's what inclusivity is all about. And this does that. From a reputation standpoint, obviously, I'd imagine that all their competitors are going to follow. Such a simple idea. I can't believe it's happening so late. So cheers to Carl and the team for the really amazing work. So moving on to another example. We all love Gap. I love Gap. I was a Gap kid in the 90s, you know. But I think one of the things we've learned is you have to show up in a way that feels really meaty and aligned and isn't just sort of for show. So last week during the election moment, Gap posted this on Twitter, and it was sort of a call for unity around their hoodie, sort of uniting red and blue. Like, you know, it's a cute message, but there was a lot of blowback. People really didn't take it the right way. It felt like kind of a flash in the pan. You'll see the clip here. My friend Phoebe Bain, a writer at Marketing Brew, actually wrote about it. And her thesis, totally agree. Your brand needs to have an opinion, but the way your brand expresses that opinion needs to be more than just something on a level of sort of surface, right? So here we didn't necessarily have that element of what's the social impact below the surface, right? Like, I mean, I don't even see a link, so it wasn't about selling these shirts, it doesn't seem. And from a reputation standpoint, you know, if people have an eye roll moment, which will happen, and it's possible to come back from those, you know, you're not necessarily getting the most that you could out of. You know, Kyle says here, Rebecca says, I was hoping you'd talk about this. Osage, a friend of mine who actually worked at Gap, is chiming in too. And I think what Kyle's saying is important. This is the headline. It's a cute message, but kind of tone deaf given the stakes. And if you're going to put your neck out, you got to have something behind it. Imagine if Gap decided to make some sort of a donation to make sure that we had, you know, an ability for all voters to have access to the polls with this. If there was something meatier that actually did one of our social impact pillars, that created equity or supported diversity or, you know, drove inclusion, this would have been more meaningful to people, and we didn't get there. Now, Gap, not to completely say all negative things about them, but we'll look at another example. So their holiday campaign this year, if you haven't seen it, take a look. It's all about unity and love, and it's like these fun, happy words. Well, Allison, let's make a note of this. Let's send out a clip to the spot after this so folks can see it if they haven't. But again, there was no pull through. So yeah, okay, awareness, maybe we get a half check on revenue instead of the full X if we're being generous. But there wasn't really a there. From a social impact standpoint, making people in general feel good is not where you want to play. It's got to be meatier than that. And from a reputation standpoint, again, like it's sort of like if there's nothing there, then you're not getting what you could from it. Rebecca says it seems very performative, and I think that's kind of the headline here. Now we know this company is also turning out some really great stuff and making max moves, so it's not all bad. If we flip to Athleta, our next example, Athleta's campaign that also launched last week, and Phoebe wrote about this as well, was sort of the polar opposite. It's an athleisure company. You can usually find me in their bottoms on most days when I'm here on Zoom. Not today, I actually dressed up for you guys. But you know, women run the future. Like really making that tie between women getting more political representation and celebrating that, and the idea of what their product actually delivers. Like that was a slam dunk, and the results followed. You know, people loved it. It got a ton of views. You know, I mean, I don't have the numbers, but I have to imagine if we looked at their books, like they saw a bump in sales on these days. So I think what we have to learn in the comparison between Athleta and Gap is just that it's got to be meaty, there's got to be pull through, and there's got to be real deep relevance between your brand, your product, your brand's history, if we harken back to City, you know, the cultural context that you can draw from to create something that's really, really impactful. Oh, and Allison just shared the link to the Dream of the Future Gap commercial. Thank you, Allison. Okay, so moving on to another example. This one I love, Facebook, okay? So Facebook has a ton of different initiatives for consumer, but they're also focused on B2B. And I think this is a relevant example for all of you who are joining here who may be, leading marketing for a B2B brand. So what they're doing is a great example of how broad the scope of social impact marketing and inclusive marketing really can be. They created Boost the Business, which is a really cool podcast that creates sort of a conversation. Almost, I might call it something similar to what we see with How I Built This and how much we love that podcast, but a conversation between corporates and the folks leading on that side and sort of smaller businesses and upstarts, and sort of creating that interaction. So almost like a mentorship sort of, not docudrama, but, documenting that interaction that we all know, if you're an upstart, is so important to have perspectives from those who are working at much larger businesses. So they created this with a focus on entrepreneurs that are, coming from a more diverse background. And it's an educational product. But of course, it also has the result of getting folks thinking about Facebook as part of their budget for marketing their businesses on both sides. So like double revenue impact there, social impact totally there. I mean, educating is something that absolutely creates equity, right? And, even creating space for those sort of mentorship moments in the content. Huge, huge play there. Reputation, for me, I mean, I felt this, like when I saw this from Facebook, it offset some of the other things I've seen that I may not have thought were as great. And we'll go to our next example for one of those. So this one, I don't want to be too negative here, but when Facebook announced they were launching a program to, I think the number is about 100 million, a commitment to donate to small businesses within the year. Super interesting, like makes you feel good. They are really supporting the Black community in a way almost similar to what we see Citi doing. But then you read the fine print, and I think the number of the donation is around 3K per grantee, per awardee of the grant. That's great. But a good percentage of that is in Facebook ad credits. So when I saw that, it gave me pause, and it made me wonder, is that a little too front-footed in the revenue impact goal? As we all know, this is a company that probably is going to get those ad dollars from these companies anyway. So is it a little too on the nose to make that a part of the grant? I would have advised they do it a different way. The social impact piece, again, this is probably more of a, you get half because, $3,000 for a small business, that could be a month of payroll. That's great. But not quite fully there because that authenticity isn't there. And then from a reputation standpoint, I think it kind of falls apart, for lack of a better way to put it. So, great intent. But again, if we're really thinking along the lines of this framework and pressure testing everything we do against it, we might be able to protect ourselves from some of these missteps. So moving on. And I think this is our last case study. This one I get really excited about. It's just so, for anyone who's in the CPG world, you guys are doing really amazing work, but this is an amazing example and something I think that smaller consumer goods companies should really be thinking about. So for Pride Week, or Pride Month rather, this year, and I believe they've done it in years past as well, Skittles took all the color off the packaging, and the message, as you can see, is only one rainbow matters during Pride. So like, you can just imagine the 7-Elevens everywhere where there were parades and we were all celebrating Pride Month. These had to have sold well. Beyond that, we know that Skittles took another step and they donated, it's either a complete amount or a percentage of the proceeds to GLAAD, which again, you really, like if they hadn't done that, it probably wouldn't be on my list as checking all three boxes, but they made sure they were doing something to actually support diversity and inclusion in a measurable way. with this sale. But beyond that, and this is an important thing for us all to remember, we all know there's a halo effect. So just because they may not have gotten, full margin from the sale of that particular Pride Pack, is that person who had that good feeling, who had that sort of affinity moment with the Skittles brand, are they more likely to pick up Skittles next time they go into 7-Eleven? I think we can all agree yes. And from a reputation standpoint, it just hits the mark. So moving on. So I want to spend some time, and we'll address this more in Q&A so you guys have questions. And sorry, so real quick, Kyle has a comment here. Yeah, it seems promotional after the initial grant. If it's successful, you're likely to continue to spend. Exactly. So he's making the point that you're developing your relationship with consumers beyond just that moment of selling that Pride Pack. I wanted to talk about how, with my company Vico, I'm focused on providing support to marketers like all of you, and businesses that are looking to really make a social impact that drives the bottom line. And I want to spend a little bit of time getting in the meat of beyond just ideating and sort of analyzing examples, how we're actually doing this work. So here are the sort of pieces of the puzzle to sort of help a brand figure out how to maximize the movement. We start with, as you've seen throughout this entire webinar, the RSR framework. That's really the foundation. That's the tool that allows you to sell into your organization, like, here's why we need to do this. And then the inputs. So I'm really focused on, and my work with marketers as a marketing success consultant is super focused on making everything really easy for my clients. You don't have a lot of time, I know that, and you don't have a ton of ability to sort of spend 6 months coming up with maybe something that might work. You need a team that's going to get in there and be able to hit the ground running. So we've designed a really fun and quick type form input approach that allows us to ask some pretty simple questions to everyone on the team that you would consider involved in figuring out what your max move, what your marketing inclusion sort of strategy is, and getting the things that we need to know from your business as far as what your existing annual plan is, what your existing goals are, what are the things that you're already doing that we can just sort of refine to become max moves. That's what this is all about. It's not about net new. It's about optimization. It's about refinement. Tony says he bought a pack of the Skittles Pride Pack. Love to hear it. So that audit makes it super easy to get started. And then we have these awesome group sessions. I'm calling them Max Move Strategy Summits. That's where we take everything that we've learned from you in the audit, that we've learned about what you need to accomplish in this year, that we've learned about your existing marketing tactics and strategies, and we talk about ways that we might co-create a plan to make them into, initiatives that hit on revenue, social impact, and reputation impact all at once. The other fun part about this is that I'm also focused on working with clients to create versions of their existing messaging, but that are really focused on making sure they sound like they're conscious of everything that's going on around them. I'll say this again, and I think we talked about it a little earlier in the chat, but inclusivity by definition is about including context. Like, we use it in one sort of way when we're talking about DEI, but if you really just drill down into the definition of the word, it's about making sure you're mindful of context. And that's just good copywriting to begin with, as we all know. But making sure that, you leave an engagement with me on Maximize the Movement with that sort of bank of conscious messages that you can use from day one in your PR and your social, and all of your initiatives and your customer emails. That's a huge part of this process as well. And so what do you get? You get your max move marketing strategy. Think of it as like sort of a 3-pager. Here's what we're doing. Here's what we're focusing. And then again, making it super easy for busy, ambitious marketing leaders like all of you to get this work done. We're going to make sure that whatever format your annual marketing plan is in, we're giving you drag and drop content that you can just add. You're not going to have to spend that time adapting it. It's not sort of like a 50-page report from a consulting firm that you then do nothing with. Like, success means something that's ready to be embedded in your work from day one. And that's why that co-creation process of the strategy summits is such a huge focus. So that's kind of the how, and I'm excited to have the opportunity to share that with you guys in this webinar format. So before we open up, oh, thank you, Sam. Sam says love the framework. So before we open up for some Q&A, I also just wanted to leave you guys with, just just a reminder, I guess. It's this whole thing has been inspiration, but I want you to think about the breadth of the opportunity here. It's easy to talk about the big splashy marketing campaigns when we're going through our examples, but this is really about the way you relate to your current and potential future consumers and customers in everything that you do. So if you're a smaller business and you're never going to have a TV spot the way that Gap did, that we need to optimize, great. What we can do is figure out how your call center speaks to customers more inclusively. We can figure out how to make sure your customer emails speak to customers more inclusively. We have my friend Asia May on the webinar right now. She works at an AI conversational chat company. And some work that we've done together for a client is around making sure that their chat feature takes into account everything going on with COVID and makes it easy for people to get answers in that moment, right? So this is not just about groups that are disenfranchised or marginalized in our society. It's also about causes that are important in our cultural moment. So being COVID aware is absolutely a part of it. And so when you think about how you approach everything you do to respond to a moment, whether it's a cultural moment or, a moment where you're creating equity, if you think about revenue, reputation, and social impact, and checking all those boxes, your business can only stand to benefit. So I'm super excited to have had this time to share with you guys. And from there, I'd love to just open up the discussion for any questions or thoughts. What's on everyone's minds? Okay, I have Allison in my ear. Yeah, so one of the questions, and I guess you got this one on a DM. So one of the questions that we do get a lot of times is around what I'm going to share here. And it's sort of, if I don't have my ducks in a row from a diversity and inclusion standpoint on my team, on my company staff, on our board, within our leadership, is it appropriate for me to be approaching my marketing with the goal of making it more inclusive? And it's a great question. And I'll start by saying all of those things absolutely need to be addressed. Hopefully not with $114 million and little impact, but making sure our companies are composed of leaders who reflect the diversity of our consumers and our society is of critical import. But while you're on the journey toward that, if you're willing to have the conversation with your consumers and your customers on how you're working on it, on where you might be behind, you can only stand to benefit from also coupling that with, and also, this is an and also, here's what we are also doing. Here's how we are City, making sure that one of our core products makes people who are non-binary feel like they don't have to be not themselves in the moment of using their credit card every single day. You shouldn't shy away from doing things like that because the whole isn't figured out. If we're going to make a commitment to inclusivity, we have to commit and we have to start now, and there is no waiting. So again, as marketers, we have budgets, we spend money on initiatives, we reach consumers. You can look at us as the most sort of action ready part of an organization, the most action ready function to be able to do those things in different ways. That's key. I have another question here from a LinkedIn user who would love some recommended resources to continue to learn more. Awesome. Well, one, shameless plug, you follow Biko on LinkedIn or our social channels. We'll continue to keep talking about this. We have a case studies page on the site that kind of highlights some of our favorites. I posted it in the event page, so you guys can take a look at that. There are a ton of other organizations doing great work. One is, I hope I get this right, Allies in Action. And that's an organization that was started by one of the Adweek mentees. We'll make sure we share the information in our follow-up for that as well. And that is really more about like the corporate conversation around diversity and inclusion and how to approach that. So that's a great resource. Definitely read Marketing Brew. Phoebe is writing about this topic all the time. That's part of what drew me to her. Super inspiring stuff. And beyond that, I think just keep your finger on the pulse. Like following certain hashtags on LinkedIn is another great way that you can, keep tabs on everything going on around the diversity and inclusion discussion. And I think it's only going to become more something that marketers are talking about as part of our strategies. I think right now there's a bit of a gray area where it's brands that have super big budgets and large teams and lots of resources are doing things. And a lot of other brands feel like, oh, well, that's really not my place to play. I think in the next couple of months, and certainly the next year and the foreseeable future, that will continue to change. And those that want to continue to dominate their categories are going to have to get on board. Because again, what does it come down to? Humans fundamentally want to be inclusive of each other. That is what we want. It's why I made friends with one of the people I used to kind of banter and argue with on Nextdoor, and now we email each other once a week, even though we're on completely different sides of the political spectrum. We want to connect. And so as marketers, let's use our resources to provide ways for this to happen in society at a faster clip. Another question. I have to take a sip of water for this one. Okay. How can agencies respectfully challenge or push back when a brand isn't meeting these max move pillars? This is a deep one. You guys are going deep. It's a great question. So here's how I would put it, because I'm going to answer that from the perspective of how I would approach it. If your role in a relationship is the service provider, right, your goal is to steer and shepherd your client towards making the best possible decisions. But the key there is it's towards making. So not you making, but them making. And so I think the thing that you do as an agency in that case is you show them what it looks like to be part of the light. You show them what it looks like to not make a decision that, leads towards potential embarrassment or darkness. You make it very vivid based on your expertise and what they trust you and pay you for, what you'd like them to know about the potential outcome of 2 or 3 or 4 different ways of doing things. And one of the ways I find really successful when it comes to sort of painting that vision is benchmarking, kind of what we just did. But making sure, and this is key, you make sure that you are approaching your benchmarking exercise based on the specific incentives that the stakeholder you're talking to cares about. And even beyond that, the stakeholder above them cares about. So if you think that your client is going to do something that is going to damage their reputation, or that is going to, leave money on the table from a revenue standpoint, or that leaves the opportunity to make a social impact that's relevant to their brand and authentic based on who they are, what they sell, and what they're about, show them the possibilities and put it in terms that help them sell it up and around. And then when you've extended all of your options, like if you really get stuck, shoot me a DM and we can work on it. But when you've expended all of your options, you need to remember that you are in a service role and your job is to paint the picture, document the picture, but you can't control the outcome. So that's how I'd answer that. Hope that helps. All right, Lauren. I love this one. How do you recommend responding when you did make a mistake in your inclusive marketing effort? I think it's all within the context of the situation, feeling like we know how to respond, can make us as an organization feel more empowered to speak up, even if we know we still have learning to do. Lauren, I think you answered your question right there. And Lauren, do you mind sharing with us, are you speaking to a particular situation? We'll see if she comes back in the chat. But it's exactly that. I said this in a video I did for the Internet Marketing Association conference a few weeks ago, and that's that there are no cancel moments. There are only calls for conversation. And if you approach it in that way, almost think of it as the same way if somebody says something you don't like on Nextdoor and it gets edgy, how you can kind of bring that conversation back. Clearly, I've been doing a lot of this because I keep referring to it. But you can bring that conversation back to a place of shared context, of possibility, and most importantly, Lauren, of humility. Really sharing where you messed up is something that more now than ever, the modern consumer relates to. I think it's when you decide not to have the discussion or shy away from it, that people really become turned off, and you turn. It's almost like it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Then the brand's lack of ability to engage, or willingness to engage, or courage to engage turns what was simply a call for a moment of conversation into more of an ongoing cancellation moment. And that's not what we want or need, and it's not what has to happen. I mean, not to get super deep on this, but Lauren, I also think that this relates back to the conversations that we've all been having with each other as a society right now. There are people who are on opposite ends of certain spectrums, and there is a lot of energy in the air, and it's easy for things to get out of hand in conversations. But if we approach these conversations from a place of, at the end of the day, that person, that brand, that consumer, that person telling us how much they hate us on Twitter, really wants the best for everyone else who shares this thing called humanity with them, you can step out of being reactionary and bring it back to that. You have the power to bring it back. And people want to be brought back, right? So hope that answers your question. But to be more tactical, I think making a statement, sharing how you messed up, sharing what you're going to do about it, and acknowledging that, you know, you didn't make the right call is the start of it. And then following that up with continued tries, right? Like, we need to keep going. We don't shy away from making a social impact just because we didn't do it right the first time. And it's just like being an ally. Like, there's no one who's an ally to a group of in society who has been underserved or has been marginalized that doesn't make mistakes the entire time. But you're an ally when you show up. So as a brand, you continue to show up. Any other questions? Levi, who's so sweet, wants to know, will you be holding more of these webinars in the future? Yes, I would love to. I plan to be coming live to you on video on Maximize the Movement and other topics that Biko's excited about and that I'm excited about in the coming weeks and months. So absolutely stay tuned. And one thing I would say is, if you're not getting our bi-weekly newsletter, other than following us on social, that's probably the best way to stay in touch. So when we do follow up with a recap, we'll make sure there's a link to subscribe to the bi-weekly so that you're always in touch with the latest on what we're thinking about and doing. And, we'll be here. So yes, Levi, thank you for the enthusiasm, and you will be seeing way more of me here on video with you. And of course, we'll be doing this with other folks. So I went solo this first time, and I don't want to tease anything, but we also have some great panel moments coming up to sort of inspire you all with. So more fun to come. And Kyle says, amen, a little humility can go a long way. Totally agree. So Allison, do I have you in my ear? Any other questions from the group? Anything else we might want to dig into? I
think that's it.
Okay, well, hey, everyone, thank you so much for taking the time to join us on a Tuesday evening after what's been quite a tumultuous month, if not triumphant. And I just encourage you all to really think about, I think someone asked, we are absolutely going to send out a link to a longer form presentation that has the framework in detail so you can have that in hand. But really think about, even if it's small, even if it's simple, ways that you can refine your existing marketing approach, that you can take what you're doing today and add actions and sort of a lens of thinking about your activities that isn't going to cost you extra time and money, but is going to be able to deliver on your revenue on your impact to society, and on your brand's reputation all at once. If you want another source for more inspiration on this, definitely read John Mackey's Conscious Leadership and Conscious Capitalism. Those are sort of two books that shaped a lot of how I'm thinking about this. And it is about that triple bottom line. Things only get better when you make a move that drives a social impact, but also delivers to your bottom line. So thank you all for being here, and we'll see you soon. Have a good evening. Okay.